Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, Woods for Wildlife. Today's topic is forest management and wetlands and conservation status, focusing on rare and endangered species. My name is Robert Barton. I'm the host for today's webinar. A couple little housekeeping things before we get into today's presentations. First of all, if you're looking for a copy of today's slides, they are available to download from the forestrywebinars.net, where you logged into today's session. You'll find them there on the main page for today's topic. Also, we'll be doing questions and answers at the end of today's session, and we ask that if you have any questions, please type them into the question and answer feature here on Zoom. To do that, you'll click on the Q&A icon, and that will then open up a window for you to enter in your questions. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our first presenter today, Jacob Comer. And Jacob, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you. Like Bob said, my name is Jake Comer. And before we begin with the presentations today, I just want to go over with everyone that's attending, and thank you all for tuning in, by the way. But I want to go over the North Carolina Woods for Wildlife Conservation Initiative, which is the group of people that's responsible for helping make this presentation possible today. So before I begin talking about the conservation initiative, I want to let you all know who I am. I'm a Farm Bill wildlife biologist. My primary role in this position is to provide wildlife management advice to landowners in North Carolina. I do this by writing management recommendations to help them improve wildlife populations on their property for whatever their objective is for their specific property. I also participate and conduct outreach events such as webinars like these that help landowners gain more knowledge, as well as resource professionals gaining the most up-to-date management techniques. In this partnership, or the Woods for Wildlife Conservation Initiative, there's several partners that I help with their monitoring and research when possible, which I'll talk about a little bit more in depth. And then there's some call share assistance for landowners that are looking to implement conservation practices on their property. And I help them navigate different call share opportunities, whether that be state or federal call share. So to begin, what is the North Carolina Woods for Wildlife Conservation Initiative? This is a project that's partially funded by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. The funding that they provide allows people like me that are hired through this project, such as the Quail Forever biologist myself, to visit with landowners and enhance habitat on their land. The purpose of this project is to increase the capacity of the partners in this program to increase landowner technical assistance. So through positions like mine, with collaboration of other partners, I'm able to help those partners meet with landowners, or whether that be lack of staffing from some of these partners to just a backlog due to the high number of private landowners that need technical assistance. But that's the primary purpose, is to get technical assistance to landowners on the ground. And then the whole reason this project is needed is because of the importance of wildlife in North Carolina. Specifically, this project focuses on the southeastern portion of North Carolina. And some of the most diverse ecosystems are found in this region due to the longleaf pine savanna. These are just some of the most important ecosystems that we have in the Southeast as a whole, and are very independent to this region. Another reason it's important to have a high amount of technical assistance available to landowners is because of the importance of timber revenue on their land. The Southeastern United States is referred to as the wood basket. It creates 1.1 million jobs and $230 billion in regional economy. So it's a big part of the South, especially in this Woods for Wildlife Conservation region. Therefore, it's very important to have people on the ground that can help landowners define their objectives and to set goals depending on where they stand with their wildlife objectives and timber objectives. And the biggest reason it's important is because of how much of North Carolina is privately held. 85% of North Carolina is privately held. You can see there in the map, all the colored regions are publicly held lands. So because there's such a large amount that's held by private landowners, it's important to have biologists on the ground that can help these landowners kind of navigate what the best management technique is for their property. So like I said, the overview of this project is to engage woodland owners in forest management. We do this primarily by focusing on enhancing habitat in longleaf forest, as well as bottomland hardwoods. We assist with management recommendations in all types of habitat, but these are the two habitat types that this project is primarily focused on. And we also do this through farm certifications. North Carolina Tree Farm is a big part of this project with Leslie McCormick. And you can see there in the bottom left are some landowners that have gone through some certifications for their property. So we can help landowners that are interested in that as well. Like I said, this is the map here of the region that I was talking about, the 14 county region. If you're listening and you have land in this region or work for one of the partners on this project, I'd be glad to talk with you about getting a biologist to your site or just more about this project if you have any questions. This is a list of the cooperating partners. The North Carolina Forest Service oversees this grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. North Carolina Tree Farm is a big partner in helping with certifications, like I said. Myself with Quail Forever, Audubon, the National Wild Turkey Federation. They all provide assistance to private landowners looking to enhance habitat on their property. And then the state agency with North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission with landowners that reach out to them that need private lands assistance, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife with the same. So to implement this project, we go on site visits with landowners. And these are some pictures of some successful site visits that have implemented conservation practices. On the top left is some native warm season grasses that we've planted, about 160 acres of permanent native warm season grass from agricultural use. We've planned a prescribed burn on the longleaf stand on the top right. And then we've done some hack and squirt and herbicide work to remove some undesirable hardwood trees in some landowners' properties. And all these are cost shareable opportunities under Farm Bill programs that I help landowners navigate. We also implement this project through outreach like this webinar. Pre-COVID, we did some in-person workshops. We did some field days. So anything that can get information out to landowners or resource professionals is another way that we implement this initiative. This is the end of year 2 of this project. In accomplishments to date, we have improved almost 700 acres of bottomlands. Almost 14,000 acres of prescribed burns have been done underneath longleaf pine canopies. Around 3,600 acres of improved longleaf habitat other than burning, such as pre-commercial thinning or herbicide work. And then we've also restored around 6,700 acres of longleaf pine. And the one stat that I think is most important is that we've assisted 243 woodland owners to implement conservation work on their property, which is the whole point of this initiative, is to be a resource to landowners. My contact information is there on this slide. If any of you feel like you want to talk about habitat management or need someone out to your property or just have any other questions, feel free to jot my info down and I will be glad to talk with you after this webinar. But now I will pass it over to John Ann that will be giving the first talk of the afternoon. Thank you.
All right. Well, good afternoon. Today, I'm going to talk to you about rare species, the many different terms for rare species, and what the implications and opportunities are for you as you manage forest in southeastern North Carolina. I work in the Raleigh Ecological Services Office of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I work with our Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, helping private landowners restore habitat on their lands for the benefit of wildlife. Oh, my screen is not, my slide is not advancing. So hang on just a minute here. There we go. Regulatory information is really not my area of expertise. I do habitat restoration to benefit listed species, but I don't list species and have never received formal training on the Endangered Species Act, but thankfully my colleagues have, and they're available to help. I chose to give this talk because I relate to foresters and to landowners, and I'm interested in this kind of information being presented in lay terms that foresters, landowners, and I can understand. So I plan to describe the Endangered Species Act and define the categories of rarity. I'll share with you the rare species that occur in the NC Woods for Wildlife 14 county focal area, and I'll highlight a few of those species. We'll cover responsibilities and opportunities related to rare species, as well as available resources. Why is this a topic on our agenda today? Well, we've heard that forest landowners are concerned about endangered species regulations, so we need to learn about them. That addresses our fear, but I think we also realize the importance and responsibility we have as stewards of natural resources. Most of us are not in the natural resource business to make big bucks. Most of us, I think, have a calling and a connection to the natural world. Aldo Leopold, the father of wildlife management, said, "Who but a fool would discard seemingly useless parts? To keep every cog and wheel is the precaution of intelligent tinkering." My employer, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, has the mission to work with others for the conservation of fish, wildlife, and plants and their habitats. The Fish and Wildlife Service has oversight of federally listed species through the Endangered Species Act. The Act originated in 1973 and has the purpose of protecting species that may go extinct and their habitats. Decisions are made on how to list a species based on science. The listing process does also involve public input, and it is based on science. It takes a lot of work and time, and certainly the decisions are not made lightly. More specifically, the Endangered Species Act is about conserving plants and animals whose populations are declining. It includes directions for listing species and recovering species. It also includes prohibitions or regulations. We generally use the word take. Take is what you can't do, but it is allowed with special permission or authorization from the Fish and Wildlife Service. So take means that you can't kill the plant or animal, but it also means other things. Take includes actions to harm, harass, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, trap, capture, kill, or collect. And take also means what I like to call habitat harassment. Habitat cannot be altered in a way that would lead to the injury or death of the endangered species. The Act has provisions for working with others too, including states and private landowners and federal agencies. Both animals and plants are included under the Endangered Species Act. Plants are considered part of the land and thus a private resource, while animals, which obviously, come and go more readily, are considered a public resource. On public lands, or when federal funds or permits are required, both are equally protected. And on private lands, the protections are a little bit different. All right, let's get into all the terms that are used to describe rare species. It's important to know what category a species falls into so that you can know its degree of rarity and its level of protection. First, we'll discuss federal terminology. These first three terms are defined by the U.S. Endangered Species Act and overseen by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And these are the ones that you may not take any of within these categories, unless you have special permission from the Fish and Wildlife Service. So there's endangered, and that means the species is in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. And threatened, the species is likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future. And I'll point out that a threatened species isn't less endangered. It actually has to do more with time, the foreseeable future piece. And a candidate species is one in which there's information that supports listing it as threatened or endangered, but it just hasn't happened yet. So these are, in the process. Now, you may have heard this term, and it's one you will want to get comfortable with, that the words at risk. At risk daily, that might mean very different things depending on the context. If I asked you to guess what an at-risk species is, you'd likely say something like, oh, it's a species at risk of extinction. Well, that may or may not be the case. What it means for us specifically is that the species is under consideration for listing. Species in this category are on the launching pad, sitting in the catapult. And eventually, every at-risk species is going to get launched or catapulted into a category. Maybe endangered, maybe threatened, maybe nothing. If the decision is nothing, meaning it doesn't warrant listing as threatened or endangered, we call that precluding the need to list. So, at-risk species are species that are either candidates, proposed, or petitioned. Okay, whoa. We know what a candidate is, we've covered that. Proposed means it has been proposed for listing as threatened or endangered. But what does petitioned mean? Well, it means that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has been sued to consider a species for listing. In 2010, the service was sued to consider 404 species for listing. So suddenly, there were a lot of at-risk species. And a couple years later, another suit included even more species, and that generated a bunch of work. Another reason I'm giving this talk instead of my friends that are endangered species biologists. A schedule has been worked out legally on how to address each of these species, so some are more pressing than others. And to add to the fun, occasionally that schedule changes. So I don't want to lose you here. We just went over the federal terms, but there are also terms that are defined by the state. The state of North Carolina, under the guidance from the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission and the North Carolina Plant Conservation Program, also makes endangered and threatened species determinations. Anything that's considered endangered or threatened by the federal government is also considered that for the state. But there are additional species that the state considers endangered or threatened because the range of consideration is so much smaller. In North Carolina, the state status, endangered, threatened, and special concern, must be approved by the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission and published in the state register for public comment. These taxa or species are given state protection under the State Endangered Species Act. And the terms significantly rare and watch list are North Carolina Natural Heritage Program designations only, not affording official state protection. I know it's easy to get overwhelmed by these terms, so be sure to know if someone is using the federal or the state terms. This map shows the state listed species. Notice the density of spots in the sandhills and the coastal plain, and of course, not surprisingly, in the Appalachians as well. And And this is a visual reminder of the area we are zeroing in on today, the 14 county focus area for NC Woods for Wildlife. All right, now let's boil this down to what matters to you. Back to the federal designations, because that's where we're focused from a legal point of view. North Carolina has 27 plants and 39 animals that are federally listed. But our 14 county NC Woods for Wildlife focus area in southeastern North Carolina only has 6 plants and 6 animals, broken down as you see here. All right, there are threatened or endangered plants. These are our threatened and endangered plants, these shown here in our 14 county focus area. And so for our purposes, really threatened and endangered are lumped together here because the protections are nearly the same. And their location, habitat, and conservation needs are shown here. You may have heard of these before, and you may have never heard of these before. Maybe you have heard of them, but I'll bet only a couple of you have ever seen these. These are really rare, so they're probably not on most of the properties that you're working on. To make a positive difference for federally listed plants, retain habitat, conduct prescribed burns, place fire lines outside of the ecotone edges, and know what you have, and avoid herbicides when rare plants are present. I suggest that you get to know these species because it's when you know something that we really begin to appreciate it. Here's one called Cooley's meadow rue. It occurs in moist, open savannas and also in power line corridors. Only 28 populations are known, so it's really very rare. You can see the counties in which it occurs. And really the biggest threat to this species is the lack of fire and the loss of habitat. Here's Michaud's sumac, another fire and disturbance dependent species. The red counties are historic locations, and it still occurs in the green counties, but it's also rare. Interestingly, this sumac is not poisonous, like the better known poisonous sumac. And also Michaud's sumac has either male or female flowers, which hinders fertilization, and certainly that contributes to its rarity. All right, and now threatened and endangered animals. There are 6 in our focus area. Red cockaded woodpecker is endangered and recently proposed for downlisting to threatened. Northern long-eared bat, which is threatened. Wood stork, also threatened. Cape Fear shiner is endangered, and the Waccamaw silverside is threatened. There's a butterfly called St. Francis satyr that's endangered and occurs only in Cumberland and Hope counties, really more specifically on Fort Bragg. And there's 2 federally listed animals that I'm going to highlight for you to consider because of your forest management. And for these 2, woodpeckers and bats, the best thing to do for them are to plant and manage longleaf, conduct prescribed burns, retain bottomland trees, and get to know what you have. So red cockaded woodpeckers you're probably familiar with are endangered, though as I mentioned, there's a proposal now that their status will be downlisted to threatened. And the implications of that, really, we don't know, and that'll be a little while before we know. But for red cockaded woodpeckers, you can't take them or their cavity trees. There are also some requirements for protection of their foraging areas. So most of you know that these birds need mature pines. 70 basal area is ideal. And they make their nest in live pines and set up in clusters. I think it's interesting that it's known that there's 27 different species that use their cavities. Things like southern flying squirrels, wood ducks, other woodpeckers, kestrels, snakes, frogs, and lizards. And moving on to the northern long-eared bat, it was listed as threatened a couple years ago, this species has had a significant decline due to white nose syndrome. That's a deadly fungus that's found primarily on bats in caves. So the bats in our focal area are obviously not in caves, and thankfully are a stronghold, not having the white nose syndrome. So the part of the Endangered Species Act called the 4D rule protects about 150 feet of forest around the roost trees from the 1st of the 1st of June to the end of July. And if bats are observed but not in a roost, no specific habitat protection measures are required. So to help bats, it's good to maintain mature forest and also apply herbicides at the lowest effective rate and avoid roost trees. Population response to prescribed fire is largely unknown, but burning in the winter during when it's really cold, like below 35 degrees, that could harm bats that are in a torpor in hollow trees. All right, so remember the at-risk species, the ones that are on the catapult, the ones that are being considered for listing? Well, in our 14 county focus area, we've got 12 plants and 6 animals that are considered at risk. So again, not too many. Here are a few of them pictured here. So let's take a closer look. Let's start with the plants. I'm sure you recognize Venus flytrap. This is a species that the Fish and Wildlife Service has been sued or petitioned to list. And studies are underway right now to see if the listing is warranted. Some of the plants on the list are not well known, really even to our best botanists, but most of the plant species, just like the threatened and endangered ones, there's a handful of things that you can do as you manage your forest to benefit them. Manage and restore habitat and use prescribed fire. Find out what you have. If you have an at-risk plant, avoid herbicides and destruction. One important and fairly easy action is the careful placement of fire lines. So here, this is an ecotone or an edge. It's where the upland habitat meets the wetland habitat. So don't put your fire line on the ecotone edge. Either bring it in, push it out, or better yet, don't put a fire line in at all and burn right through the wetland if possible. All right, now these are the at-risk animals in our 14 county focus areas. And I will say last week, the black rail actually changed from at-risk to federally threatened, but these slides were already made. All right, so there's 2 that I would like to highlight because of their relationship with forest. You may be able to make a particular difference for these 2 with certain forest management strategies. I'll point out that it's unlikely that you have these on your property. And Nathan Shepard, who's going to speak after me, is an expert on gopher frogs and the eastern diamondback. And you'll learn a lot more about these from him. But for now, I'll tell you that well-managed and regularly burned longleaf is important to these species. And if you have them, there may be opportunities to fine-tune the timing of your burning to ensure the best outcome for them. So it is your responsibility to know what you have and to avoid take of these few listed species. But you have the opportunity to benefit many species. Follow these key practices that I've mentioned many times already, and that will certainly make a positive difference for these as well as many species that aren't listed or at risk. So people often ask about eagles, and I wanted to mention the bald eagle is no longer listed under the Endangered Species Act because it's really doing very well across our country and in North Carolina. But it is still protected under the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. And I'm happy to provide specific guidance if you have an eagle nest and you're going to do some forestry work. You can just, reach out to me or the Fish and Wildlife Service. Anyone there can help you. So I've said several times that I recommend that you know what you have. So here are some ways to know. I'm going to talk about a few resources available to you. You can reach out to me or anyone with the Fish and Wildlife Service, you know, for starters. And the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program is an important state agency that keeps data on rare species of all sorts. And again, Nathan will tell you more about that, I'm sure. But I do want to go into this. Natural Heritage has a tool to help you know if your land is in close proximity to rare species. This can help you learn about species and opportunities you have to benefit them. It covers many more species than just those that are federally listed. So specifically, the Natural Heritage Data Explorer is a mapping web application that provides interactive access to maps and data representing natural heritage resources and other conservation values in North Carolina. Account holders can generate site-specific project review reports. Subscription accounts allow users to view element occurrences and generate unlimited project review reports. And so these project review reports, there's an output. They include rare species, natural areas, managed areas that are right within your project's footprint and also within a mile buffer. And I think it's always good to remind people that natural heritage data is only as good as the surveys that have been conducted in that area. So if no surveys have been done or species reported, then the information from the data search really might be a little bit less accurate than what you think. But this is certainly a great resource. Another is the North Carolina Forest Service's pre-harvest planning tool, and several of you are familiar with this already. It can be beneficial, especially to foresters who are planning to harvest, or for landowners who don't plan to harvest, but they just want to know more about their land. So you can access this tool at this website, and you can identify an area and run a report. And on the second page of that report, you'll see a section that lists all the federal or state endangered or threatened species within 2 miles of the tract. So the tool uses this same natural heritage data to generate the section. The report information is not quite as detailed as what you get from the natural heritage tool, but it provides a good way to get really valuable information. And beyond the site summary report, the Forest Service's pre-harvest planning tool is meant to help forest activities prevent impacting water quality in a negative way. So the idea is if landowners and operators have the right information, then they can take steps to do things the right way before they harvest timber. And that improvement could manifest itself through properly located skid trails and roads, avoid stream crossings, or put into place better stream management zones. So in this way, we can reduce any adverse impacts that forestry might have on wildlife, particularly threatened and endangered species that are aquatic. So I would like to challenge you to look for opportunities to benefit rare species throughout your forest management and to seek out resources to help you. And I really appreciate your time. And I would like to now stop sharing my screen, and I will turn it over to Nathan Shepard with the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program.
Hey everyone. So I'm Nathan Shepard with the Natural Heritage Program. I'm their Eastern Region Field Biologist. We're going to talk about embedded wetlands, and you're going to hear this term isolated wetlands. So I'm going to talk a lot about wetlands, their ecology, some of the species that use these wetlands, specialize with these wetlands, and then forage management restoration practices for these on your landscape. So real quickly, I'm just a field biologist. My expertise is primarily in reptile amphibians, so herpetology, but I do work with rare plants natural communities, which is a fancy term for habitat, specific habitats. And yeah, primarily in the Carolinas and in the longleaf forest. So isolated wetlands. Why we use that term is because they're not connected to other water bodies. They're truly isolated. They don't have streams going through them. They're just rainwater collects in a basin and they fill during part of the year and they dry out during part of the year. Most of the time they are on top of the ridge, a sand ridge or a sand hill. Sometimes they're kind of down lower, but most of the time they're on top of a hill. They're open canopy and they have lots of emergent vegetation, and herbaceous layer is really rich. There's lots of sedges and grasses that make this up. So the take home here is that they're ephemeral in that they have a dry period and a flooded wet period, and that they have real rich herbaceous layer and lack a canopy, right? Some of these will dry out annually. You often see them fill up in the fall and winter and then dry out during the summer. Sometimes these are so big that they might hold water for multiple years, specifically if we have like a really wet period, like we did a few years ago where we had a couple years that were really wet in a row. And then there's some that are so big that it might take a drought year to really completely dry them out. But typically they're an annual cycle. And within the longleaf pine forest, they are fire maintained. For years, people would exclude fire from these communities, thinking that they're a refuge for plants and wildlife that needed that refuge from fire. That's not really true. Most of the native, or all of the native species in these longleaf landscapes are, they've survived with fire. They need it. And these ponds are no different. This is a picture of the same pond. They planned to burn this in the growing season when it was at its driest, and unfortunately it rained a few days before they burned this, but you still see the effect of getting fire in there and what it does to prevent trees from growing and to help that herbaceous layer. So the purpose of these isolated wetlands for this talk and in general, it is for providing a resource for different species. This is just kind of a simple, this is a maybe salamander. It's a special concern species in the state, relatively rare. This species, its terrestrial adult form on the left, is a species that spends its time in the uplands. And it only really comes to these ponds when it fills in the winter, where it lays eggs. Their larvae mature to a metamorph, which is an immature terrestrial form, and then they leave the pond to live in the uplands. So what I'm trying to show here is that this is a resource for all these species for breeding. There's also species like chicken turtles that'll use this for food. It's a seasonal resource for food. So this is something that can produce or be a resource on your land, but also think of it in terms of the upland. This is definitely something that these species need, the uplands as well as the pond itself. So you have to think of both and not one or the other. So isolated wetlands on the landscape, when I say they're ecologically regulated, what I mean are the two primary features that naturally occur that keep these open canopy with that rich herbaceous layer is hydroperiod and fire. Fire does a lot of the work, but if you didn't have fire, you would start seeing longleaf pop up in these ponds. And so hydroperiod keeps the trees out, fire keeps the herbaceous. So both of these things kind of help regulate the landscape. And you'll often see on certain properties that the wetland has been ditched and drained and it's full of trees. So if you were to fill that, you got to have both. You got to have fire and you got to restore the hydroperiod to have that functioning. They also vary in size. The biggest I've ever seen is probably like 100 acres, but they can be very small, a quarter of an acre, even smaller probably. And they also vary in abundance. So in the Sandhills region, we often think of them as kind of a rare thing. You might see a large isolated wetland, every 5 miles or so. They're pretty rare. But here's a screen capture of Camp Lejeune where, they're limesinks, they're different geology, but they're more abundant. Their permeability also varies. Most of these probably don't have much permeability, but limesinks might have more. And geology. In the Sandhills, we have clay-based depressions And then like if you think about Rayford and the Carolina Bay country of Robeson County, you get clay-based bays. You move over to Bladen, you get more peat-based bays, and they're a little different. And then towards the coast, Camp Lejeune, Croatan, you get these limesink depressions, and they have different geologies, but they tend to be similar in the fact of that grassy open canopy. So in the Natural Heritage Program, we publish a list of the natural community types in North Carolina. And the reason I'm showing this is to show you the diversity of these wetlands. They're not just one thing, but they typically are open canopy and grassy. I wanted to point out the cypress savanna natural community. That is specific to larger clay-based bays, typically, that have this rich herbaceous layer, but also have an open canopy of pond cypress. And those are bays that, while they are isolated and they can be ephemeral, they often have some sort of mucky soil or wet soil, even when they're dry, that's why that cypress is there. So these things aren't necessarily one thing across the board. They can vary a lot. And now I'm going to change over a little bit to the gopher frog. So gopher frogs, like much of species you find in longleaf, are endemic to the longleaf ecosystem. So where the longleaf ecosystem has been imperiled, it's only had cascading effects to the wildlife that's found there. We typically think of gopher frogs as winter breeders, breeding primarily in February and March, but they will sometimes breed earlier than that and linger around a little later. We have found since the year 2015 that they will use fall breeding specifically because of hurricanes. So they do take advantage some years of breeding twice in a year. They have, with everything in longleaf ecosystem, co-evolved with summer or growing season fire. And that's mainly because during that time of the year, they're not moving on the landscape. They're in their underground refugia. They use stump holes, and I'll mention that in a minute, during that time of year. And in the winter, they're moving whenever, especially during wet years, when we get rain events, they're on the landscape moving, trying to migrate into these isolated wetlands to use those to breed and go back to their stump holes. There we go. Dependent on underground refugia. In this particular part in North Carolina, we're specifically talking stump holes. Further south, when you get into Georgia, you get gopher tortoises, which can provide that for them there. But here, stump holes, I kind of want this to be a take-home point. Stump holes are very important. I don't know how much money is in pulling stumps anymore, but wherever it can happen, I encourage keeping stumps. It's not just for gopher frogs. Basically, any animal that doesn't have wings can rely on stump holes for a refugia, for fire, or in the gopher frog's case, to actually live year-round in. The only reason they would ever use this or leave this stump hole is to breed in these isolated wetlands. So they're as important, maybe even more important for other species than these isolated wetlands. When John Ann brought up the eastern diamondback, this is mission critical for eastern diamondback conservation, is to have stump holes on your landscape. And also gopher frog requires typically a large tract of decent quality to high quality longleaf. This is a publication by Jeff Humphreys and Mike Sisson some years ago when they did radio telemetry on adult gopher frogs that have bred in a pond and where they're moving out to their stump holes, to their refugia where they spend the rest of the year. And they wanted to get an idea of what spatially area these frogs required that we need to maintain in that growing season fire, or that we need to otherwise think about. And so the longest distance is about 2.2 miles, but the average was around 1 mile. And in other populations, we've also seen that about a mile is kind of where they want to go. Now this maybe has some reflection on habitat quality in the area, that they have to move further, or stump hole presence. Maybe there's not as many suitable stump holes in the near area around that pond, so they have to move a little further. We don't know that, but typically these things require more upland habitat than previously thought. And I just wanted to mention that the gopher frog is endangered on the state level. John Ann talked about it being an at-risk species federally, but it is certainly a species that that is rare on the landscape. Some wetland pressures and threats. I just want to mention this because, you know, we talk about these isolated wetlands, and one of the reasons we're highlighting it is it's fairly rare on the landscape. And one of the reasons is they're just gone. This is aerial imagery of Robeson County, where the clay-based bays were, or well, some are still there. But you can see the outline in some of these agriculture fields of how many bays were there. And some of these probably supported gopher frogs and other rare wildlife. Other things like poor management, just decades of fire suppression or occasional dormant season fire. You know, this all leads to loss of breeding habitat, lack of connectivity between wetlands and habitat. And then, you know, I just want to highlight ground disturbance. That's a big one. I've seen ponds not eradicated, but certainly suffer one night of somebody taking an ATV out there. So ground disturbance is a big one. So think of that when you think about management within the basin of the wetland. Ground disturbance is a huge one. Water usage, climate change, these are things that are just kind of variables. Not sure how they're gonna, you know, change these, but they are certainly a pressure on these wetlands going in the future. This is just kind of highlighting all of those issues in a couple pictures. I don't have the dates for these aerials, but they're certainly decades apart, and you can see that urbanization has taken over, more roads have cut off, habitats, connectivity is an issue, fire suppression. You know, wherever there's roads, that drives fire suppression. You can't really burn along a major highway. And then even though the wetlands in this image are still intact, they haven't been ditched or drained, they certainly are not the same. And the species that were there in the left image are likely not there in the right. And then this is highlighting what an idyllic wetland should look like to what it can become with the lack of fire. And the image on the right is not an image of gopher frog, is not a pond a gopher frog is going to breed in or even use. It just wouldn't be there anymore if that was the only pond on the landscape. What you see is a complete takeover of trees, shrubs. All of this stuff leads to different pH, that the frogs typically like a pH around 5 in these isolated wetlands, and it just totally changes over. These are not the same ponds left to right, but they're just kind of showing you that maybe it's not that drastic, that these gradual changes can also. So at the top left is a pond that ornate chorus frogs use. They're also a state endangered frog in North Carolina. And in the right hand, following the arrow, is a pond they're also in, but there's not as many of. And it's probably because you're losing that grassy component. You're getting more shrubs. You have more of a canopy, those kind of factors. It also, both of those are borrow pits, and one has more of a gradual grade to it, where the other has much steeper. And those steeper grades are just harder to get fire in there, and they're also a little harder to get the herbaceous layer going. And the bottom set of images is just, you know, that idyllic, large, ephemeral, isolated wetland, and then what it can become after just a short few decades, especially with a couple drought years and lack of fire, can get those loblollies growing throughout the basin. This is the lower right-hand corner image is an image that Alvin Braswell, a biologist that worked with gopher frogs through his career, said in the 1980s was the best gopher frog spot in the Southeast. It no longer has gopher frogs. So, you know, just fire suppression, few decades can do a lot on these wetlands, even if they're still intact. This aerial imagery over to the right goes from the 1950s to the 2006, and you can see how fire suppression just kind of snuffed out that pond. In 2006 from 1988, you see how fires kind of restored the landscape to some extent, and it certainly is much better now. But what we want to see is going back, right? Not time travel, but, you know, restoring fire, getting fire in these pond basins to kind of get that open herbaceous canopy, or the open canopy herbaceous layer going. And then, you know, I just want to highlight connectivity issues. This is a pond that gopher frogs could probably use today, but it's like 5-6 miles from the nearest gopher frog pond. through private property, through other property, and over multiple roads. So connectivity issues, even if you got these nice ponds, can be a moot point in some populations. So the status of gopher frogs in North Carolina, this isn't everywhere where they occurred historically. This is just where we've gathered records. And on the left is records from the Museum of Natural Sciences. These are specimens largely collected from the 1950s to now. And they show distribution at that time, and then where we know they are at today. And today they're basically 6 to 7 populations, primarily along the coast and in the sandhills. So management strategies. I want to take some time to talk about management, restoration of these isolated wetlands. Now, when I say the best, I mean the most. If you want to go strategy that's the most idyllic, best for these gopher frogs and other wildlife, is going to mimic more of that natural growing season fire regime. I know not everybody can do that on their property. So if any of these take-homes can benefit you, I hope they will. So rotation of 3 years is great. Burning through that pond basin, even if you cannot do growing season fire on your property, getting fire into that pond basin. And that may take burning, if you're doing dormant season fire, burning in a really dry year where you're not going to have that water in that pond in the winter. Those kind of strategies can help, but getting that fire through the basin is critical because it keeps that ecotone open, and it also promotes grassy and depromotes trees and shrubs. And then try not burning during the breeding window. So that spring, fall, especially, and even during the breeding windows when we say that. So even though gopher frogs primarily breed February and March, when it starts raining in December and November, they're starting their migration. And they don't jump stump hole to stump hole. They might come out of their stump hole and get under a thing of wiregrass. So they're on that landscape. They're vulnerable to predation, but also to fire during that window. And we've seen some dormant fires take frogs before. And so watching that burn window, if you have to burn during the winter, burning during dry years, can help. But growing season is always going to be the best. And when I mention growing season, I'm specifically talking late April through June, July. And then limiting ground disturbances are specifically to the basin. If you're drawing your fire lines, you don't want to go through the middle of a pond. You want to, and not around the edges either. You want to incorporate that pond into your fire plan. And of course, leaving wetlands intact. If you just cannot have fire on your landscape, just leaving them intact in there will benefit some wildlife. Maybe it's a common species, but that has cascade food web effects for other wildlife. Okay, so what if you have a pond on your property and it's just been ditched, it's been drained, it's full of trees, it's in that state that's just not conducive of gopher frogs or other wildlife? Well, there are measures you can take to do restoration on those ponds. I will say that restoration takes time. Sometimes when we talk about our restoration projects, I joke that it's a 10-year pond. And lo and behold, 10 years later, we're still talking about it being a 10-year project. These things take time. Sometimes it's a quick fix. Most of the time it's not. It's trial and error. The methodology is not precise. It's not a list of, you go through A and F through that list and you get it done. But I'm just going to show you some things that can help. Removing tree and shrub cover. And I know that leads to some ground disturbance, but the key is to minimize that. So removing tree, shrub cover, filling in ditches. One thing you don't want to do is fill in a ditch before you need to remove the trees and the shrubs. You kind of have to think these things out. So filling in ditches and reintroducing fire is crucial. And then I put choosing appropriate wetlands. That's more for people that have a at-risk species or a rare species or species you want to manage for. If you have a population, think about the wetlands close to that population and where there's ideal habitat. Often when I discuss with other people with technical guidance, with other agencies, we're looking at a state endangered or at-risk species, and we're thinking about ways to connect that metapopulation to other ponds and which one we should restore first or so forth, put the effort in. And again, this takes time. This is not something, and this is only a few things I've mentioned. There's probably other things you can incorporate. On the right-hand side, you can see a bay that's been restored partially. The removing trees and shrub has been done, but to this day, fire really hasn't had a chance at that location because there's a major highway going along it. There's multiple agencies that have to work together on these fires, and you know, it's life. It's not just going to happen one day. It takes a lot of work. There's also a more experimental approach, wetland creation. This is Wildlife Resources Commission did this on Sandhills Game Land. They made a wetland. It's a liner pond. It's kind of been a trial and error, success and failure kind of thing. It just, you know, it's experimental. But gopher frogs have successfully bred in that wetland. So in that sense, it's been a success, but it certainly wasn't an easy road to get there. And I just want to leave you with a few comments about these ponds. So here's an idyllic pond. Ponds on your property may not look that way. That's okay. They may be a lot smaller. That's okay. If you have a really small pond that's just a couple 100 feet in size, that's may not be suitable for gopher frogs, but that could be suitable for smaller chorus frogs, tree frogs, you know, where you're managing for gopher frogs and where you're managing like you have gopher frogs. You have other species, went backwards, like ornate chorus frogs, which is another state endangered species. A lot of what I've talked about, the ecology, forest management, restoration, can be applied to that species as well. I mentioned this earlier, maybe salamander is a special concern species in the state. It's a species that gives us kind of a head scratch. It's not as clear-cut management and habitat specificity as, say, the ornate chorus frog and the gopher frog, but it's also an at-risk species. And if you have it on your property, I'd say congratulations. It's a wonderful species. Going backwards again. The tiger salamander, you're not going to find it in the coastal plain, but in the sandhills, it's a state-threatened species. It's another species that you manage these ponds, even small ones. If they're around, they'll show up. Southern chorus frog is a big one if you're in like the Robeson, Hoke County area, even other places in the coastal plain. That is a species that's not listed, but it is certainly a species that's at risk. And we've seen a huge decline in that species now that we've done some resampling efforts throughout its historical range. We're not finding in most of its range. It's about a 500, 600 mile or square kilometer area that we're finding most of the population. But, you know, more surveys need to be done. They could pop up in other areas. We don't know. But what my take home here is, you know, keeping stump holes on the landscape, fire throughout the ecotone and the basin, managing the upland and the ponds at the same time, incorporating them all in the same management plan and the same burn block if you can really do wonders for these species. And even if you don't have a rare species or you don't know what species is there, increasing biodiversity and increasing biomass on your property is only going to have cascading effects for everything in the uplands. There's a species of rare snake called the southern hognose snake that exists in longleaf upland sand ridges. It eats spadefoot toads primarily. So even if you have a pond that you know, plug the ditch, you got water, and all that you can get there to breed is spadefoot toads, hey, you got diet for a rare species. So, you know, it's more just, it's managing your landscape and incorporating isolated wetlands for the benefit of everything, not just one species. I just want to acknowledge people that I've worked with on these projects, learned from, and then I want to give some photo credits where I've stolen their photos. And I'll let Robert take it over from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. Folks, at this time, if you have any questions, I ask that you, if you haven't already entered them into the Q&A feature here on Zoom, please do so at now. We will start going through those questions here in a second. But before we do that, I do want to take this moment just to thank John Ann and Nathan and Jake for taking the time and the people in the backgrounds and behind the scenes that have helped pull this webinar together. So if you got questions, please enter them in and we'll get started with our first question. And that question is from Lindsay Small. She's wondering, can you further explain the safe harbor program for the red-cockaded woodpecker?
Sure, I'd be glad to. The red-cockaded woodpecker safe harbor was the first safe harbor in the country, and it started right in the Sandhills of North Carolina in the mid-90s. And the safe harbor program in the Sandhills is still active. And there is also statewide safe harbor for red-cockaded woodpeckers. The Sandhills one is administered under the guidance of the Fish and Wildlife Service, or under the direct, it's run by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and statewide, the Wildlife Commission does that. But it is a voluntary agreement for landowners who want to manage and restore longleaf that's beneficial to woodpeckers. And then it offers them the assurances of no additional regulatory responsibilities if additional birds, show up on the property as a result of their work. Hope that helps.
The next question, again from Lindsay, she was wondering, do you know if there is consideration for the Natural Heritage Program viewer/application to be implemented in additional states or areas?
So it has been implemented in other states and areas. I'm not sure which states and areas those are, but most states have a natural heritage program. They're not always with the state government like ours is. Some are with universities or tied to other agencies like other DNRs. But if you search natural heritage program for your state, most states should have them. I know Virginia does, I know South Carolina does. And they'll be able to better tell you if they do. I believe Virginia does and South Carolina doesn't have a viewer application, but I could be corrected on that. Sorry, I can't answer that more.
And as somebody who is not with Natural Heritage, I will say we are very lucky here in North Carolina, because our North Carolina Natural Heritage Program is probably superior to all the other states. And that tool is one example of that.
All right, the next question is from Barbara Sipierski. And Barbara, I apologize if I mispronounced your last name. Doesn't burning the area kill the exact animals and plants that you are trying to save?
So it's a complicated answer. Yes and no is the true answer. So burning is all about time with most of these species. So as I mentioned with the gopher frog, growing season fire, they're in that time of year, they're in their stump holes, and I have frogs that I've monitored in stump holes, and I've seen a fire go over them, and they're safe. So during that time of year, when fire naturally occurred thousands of years ago, they're safe. And so that's why I tend to say, not only for the ecology of the landscape, but also for the animals, burning in the growing season is the most desirable, because it's most like it was historically. These things have been on the landscape for thousands of years with fire, and so they're safe in that time. And when I did mention for a second that I have seen them die in dormant season fire. So it is true that sometimes on the calendar, that fire can be problematic for them. Specifically with growing season fire, and in wet years when we know those frogs are on the landscape, we'll often get calls from people that can only do dormant season fire, like DoD facilities sometimes can only do dormant season fire because of what they house. And so they'll call and say, okay, I can burn tomorrow. We're like, well, it's been really wet year. Gopher frogs are probably on the landscape. Please do not burn tomorrow. And so yes and no is the answer.
I'll also chime in with that from a little broader perspective. These plants and animals have evolved with fire, and I'll speak about plants first. They're disturbance, those rare ones we were just talking about, they're disturbance dependent. They simply won't survive without the fire. Natural succession will continue on if fire is suppressed, and those plants will be, they won't be able to continue. When a fire comes through and actually burns up the plant material, the part of the plant that's underground or the seed source is fine. And as Nathan pointed out, the animals can physically hide or run away or fly away or whatever. But if that fire doesn't happen, the very habitat they depend on is lost.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's a good point. Certainly fire can take some, but if you pull fire out from the landscape, it's going to take them all. And I'm going to tell you from decades of chasing snakes, they know where all the holes are in the ground. They'll find refugia.
All right, thank you. So the next question is from Lauren Monda, and she's wondering, can isolated wetlands be groundwater fed, or are they only considered isolated wetlands if they are fed by rainwater?
So they can be groundwater fed. I can't think of a certain one in our area that is, but Patsy Pond area in Croatan, there's a couple ponds that probably have some groundwater influence or some sort of permeability there. Limesinks may have some. We've had issues with some of the water quality in some limesinks, and we don't know why that's happening because it's not in other limesinks like right next to it. So we don't know if that's a groundwater is to blame. But typically, by and large, rainwater is filling these ponds.
Okay, thank you. From Lauren Killian, Nathan, she wants to know, how do you learn about these areas where species have been identified? I'm assuming a landowner contacts you to come out and do an inspection. What is the time lag between notification and site visit / verification?
So that's kind of complicated to answer. Most landowners don't reach out to us. Sometimes they do, but most of the time it's us reaching out to them. it's us. You know, we a lot of times, you know, the raw way we look for species, we just look at aerial. We look at aerials, and we find where we think we see habitat, and then we ask if we can come out. Especially with these isolated wetlands and gopher frogs, since they require such a larger version of these isolated wetlands, we typically can see them pretty easily on aerials. Sometimes modeling is used. I know other natural heritage programs have done modeling to kind of figure out where there could be habitat and then going and doing on-foot inspection of that. And then a lot of our surveys is going to historical sites where we knew at one time the species occurred. And so we go back out to see if they're still there. But I would say the biggest one for me is just looking at aerial imagery and then seeing that as private property and contacting that person. Occasionally, we also do what we call acoustic monitoring. And because frogs sing in the rain, we know that if we drive public roads that we can hear that frog. Now, that's not going to find that population that's really far from the road, but if, you know, in the eastern half of the country, we have roads everywhere. So it's pretty easy to drive roads on wet nights in the winter and find some populations or, you know, monitor some populations that we can't otherwise access physically.
So that does bring up a good point, though. If somebody, so besides the wetlands and the species that are associated with that, what if somebody speculates that they might have an endangered or threatened species on their property? Where would they go for, you know, to find somebody that could help them identify that and be aware of that so they can perform management that's suitable?
Well, I would say that the first place to start is the internet, of course. And if you go to the Fish and Wildlife Service's webpage, you can look up the endangered species that are in our state and read a few of the basics about their habitat to know whether that even makes sense that they might occur on your property. There are county lists too. Does that species even occur in your county? Does it use the kind of habitat you have? You know, and then, you know, if you think that it might be, you know, possible, they are rare, I'll say that, but if you think it might be possible, yeah, call the Fish and Wildlife Service, and then, you know, there's experts that can say right away, it's not likely, or hey, maybe we could come out and survey. That's not something we get to do a lot because it's just not our role to be able to survey every landowner's property. We just are very limited. But if it seemed really likely based on your descriptions or perhaps photographs or whatever, then that might be of interest. Or if it's likely and we're not sure, we might still just give you management recommendations for that without even having to come verify that.
All right, thank you. From Richard Howell, without a doubt, the red-cockaded woodpecker has made a significant recovery due to joint efforts of a number of organizations. From a wildlife conservation perspective, is the current data that validates the recent proposed downlisting of the RCW? No, is there current data that validates the downlisting?
Yes, so good point. Yeah, there has been a lot of effort made by many partners to help that species. And I'm sure because there's a process where data is considered, that is definitely part of that downlisting decision. The tricky part is it is a management dependent species. And so it's going to be downlisted, and we'll certainly look towards our partners to continue to do management to continue that species on, because you can't turn away from it. It requires active management and protection.
All right, the next question is from Aaron Cork. They're wondering, are there any recommendations regarding the practice of disking in relation to wetlands and adjacent uplands where rare amphibians may occur?
Yeah, it's always a hard one trying to figure out where you want to disc on your property. I would definitely not disc along the wetland because you want to incorporate that fire plan into the wetland from the uplands. But as far as in the uplands, I would just use your best judgment, use roads. You want to take as little habitat as you can. You want to minimize your ground disturbance as much as possible. But I just want to highlight not disking along the wetland and trying to incorporate fire into the wetland. I hope that answers that question.
All right, thank you. From Doug, he has a pond area on his property which he has under CSP plan. This area was logged years ago, and the plan calls for reseeding cypress and black gum. He's wondering, what would your recommendation be for this type of area?
I probably would not reseed black gum if the pond used to have cypress in it, and I'm assuming pond cypress, if it's a pond and not associated to bottomland. Yeah, sure, put some cypress in there, pond cypress, but I would not reseed it thick. I would keep it open enough to where you're getting some grasses and stuff established.
All right. From Barbara, can you clarify stump holes? Are you advocating for removing stumps or leaving them?
I'm definitely advocating for leaving the stump holes where they are. They're important refuse for, I think the number is up to about 250 species in the Southeast. I've seen toads using them. I've seen, well, mice using them. I've seen snakes using them. There's every species that doesn't have a wing is probably going to use a stump hole at some point. So definitely leave stump holes there. And what I mean by stump holes is when a tree dies, whether it's windfall or any way a tree falls, that stump and the roots are going to start rotting. Fire is going to come in, and there's all these processes that take over. And what it does is it channelizes. So all the roots and the main heart of that stump is all going to become open. And so when I say stump holes, that's what I'm referring to, is directly to stumps. Stumps turn into stump holes. Not all of them turn into suitable ones for wildlife, but on the average, most of them do at some point in their life cycle or after life cycle. And so a lot of species use them for refuges. Eastern diamondbacks use them to hibernate in during the winter. Well, most things use them to hibernate, and they use them as a refuge for when fire comes through. So definitely leave them on the landscape.
Yeah, so you're not saying that people should pull stumps to create holes. These are just holes that are formed by the natural process of the stumps decaying and being broken down over time by things like fire.
Often when we go and survey for rare species like eastern diamondbacks, and we go to an area and we don't see stumps on the ground, that's a real open and shut case. They're probably not there. because they just absolutely require stump holes to be there.
And sometimes even when it looks like the stump is still there fully, it may have holes on the sides and underneath that are not visible without further, close inspection to us.
Yeah, there are sometimes stump holes that snakes use that the woody part of the stump is gone. It's just, the hole now.
All right. Folks, we still have time for a couple questions. If you still have any questions, feel free to enter them into the Q&A feature. Jake, do you got anything you'd like to add to the conversation this afternoon?
No, I think all the questions were good. I appreciate you both, John Ann and Nathan, for helping with the presentations. I know I certainly learned a lot. I do want to put a plug in for the next 2 webinars that we're going to be having. It'll be at the same time on the 22nd, a week from today. And then we'll have one more on the 5th of November. And these are similar presentations covering longleaf management, and then some more rare and endangered species. But they should be pretty good presentations, and I encourage everyone that's listening today to tune into those as well.
And they will be available again through forestrywebinars.net. So if you mark your calendars and come back to that site, you'll be able to find them there to view here in the next couple of weeks. So one more question has come in, and that question is there a conflict with site prep for forestry practices like tree planting and retaining stump holes?
Yeah, there can be. It just depends on, from what I've seen, and I'm not a forester, how rigorous the site prep is. Yeah, there can definitely be a conflict. I definitely would urge whoever's doing the site prep to keep as many stumps on the ground. Even if they're small, you never know what they can really turn into, but yeah, there can be a conflict there.
I would say most traditional site prep that I'm used to, especially in this 14 county focal area, which would be herbicide, maybe a site prep burn, that would not cause a problem with those stumps, and that is a good way to go.
Yeah, the only one I could think of being a problem would be intense bedding, where they would put the stumps up, root them up just to create a bed to get them out of those wet areas. Might be, that's an intense site prep disturbance that may have an effect.
I was going to say, I should have mentioned this. Yes, bedding is, when I mention ground disturbance, that's one of the things I'm trying to incorporate there is bedding is really bad for these animals, particularly because you're disturbing the ground so much, you're not getting the benefit of the herbaceous layer, but also just digging them up and not leaving those stump holes. Thanks for saying that, Jacob.
So we've had another question come in from Lauren Killian, and she says, management can be costly. Are there funds or cost share available for landowners to perform proper management activities on one's property? And I'm going to put a little bounds on that because the answer is yes from a management standpoint. Are there funds specific to what we were talking about today? The endangered species, wildlife management type funds?
Yeah, so that's what I help landowners with in this 14 county region, is getting access to those funds based off of the management that they're wanting to do on their property. So a lot of these landowners that are interested in upland restoration, there's very simply, there's different pools of money that you can apply for in the federal government, NRCS. There's some state opportunities that exist. And depending on what you're trying to manage for is going to dictate which program best suits you. But that's something that you can get technical assistance biologists to help you walk through. But if you're looking for just somewhere to start and looking at different programs, I would encourage you to go to the Natural Resource Conservation Service and look at, there's a program EQIP, EQIP, or CSP. There's a lot of stuff to read on that. It can kind of be overwhelming. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife has a partners program. I'm sure John Ann can speak on that. The North Carolina Forest Service, they have a program as well. And each one of these programs works a little bit different. But just identifying the resource concerns or how you're wanting to manage in your objectives, and then getting someone out there to help you walk through that process to get that cost share would be the first step.
Yeah, and I would say that that's perfect, Jake. And all of us that work as technical assistance biologists want to meet you and figure out what your objectives are, and then help match you with whatever program is the best, and depending on what it is you want to accomplish with your land. And sometimes that's the Farm Bill programs through the Natural Resource Conservation Service. Sometimes people are better paired with working with Forest Service, or perhaps with us with the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program. So anybody that comes out are, great partners with the Wildlife Commission, the Forest Service, NRCS. They know all of these programs, and they're happy to direct landowners to the right match for them.
All right. Don't see any more questions have come in. So at this time, I just like to thank everybody for their effort in putting together such a wonderful webinar for our audience. Thank you all three of you, Nathan, Jake, and John Ann, for the time and effort. It's been a wonderful program today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.